As a conservative Republican, I, like many of my colleagues, we like to look to the founders, and we revere the founders, we revere the Constitution. They set a standard, they set an example that I think if Americans would follow today, we would all be better for it. And what I'm talking about, in 1787, between May and September, 55 men, and ladies, there weren't any women in the room, but those 55 men from 12 states, because Rhode Island had boycotted, they came together. Now, these were men of principle, men of passion, men of conviction. Many of them were ideologues, but the challenge they had, many of their principles collided. If you read the memoirs, if you read the journals, if you read the correspondence between many of the delegates to that federal convention, they called it at the time, and it was the Pennsylvania State House that they met in. Today we call it Independence Hall. But those delegates to that federal convention, they all had different ideas about how to form a better union. Madison came with a blueprint, a draft of something entirely different. You had the Articles of Confederation, but they came to strengthen and solidify a new nation. The challenge they had, their principles, their convictions collided. Many of those men had vitriolic differences with each other. But out of that 5-month period of time came 3 miracles. The second miracle was the bringing forward of the Constitution. For the first time in the history of mankind, there was a form of government that had 3 separate but equal branches, that had checks and balances, that not one branch controlled, that the executive branch would carry out the policies of the legislative branch, but it would be tempered by a judicial branch, and yet that judicial branch could be impeached and overturned by the legislative branch. And this idea of these 3 separate but equal branches of government was brilliant. Bringing forward that Constitution was the second miracle. The third miracle, just like the Constitution, for the first time in the history of mankind, individual liberty rights, freedom of speech, freedom to worship according to your conscience, freedom of assembly, protection from self-incrimination, the right to defend yourself under the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Those concepts of individual liberty rights, for the very first time, were so clearly articulated in the Bill of Rights. And so if the Constitution was the second miracle and the Bill of Rights was the third miracle, one has to ask the question, what was the very first miracle that occurred? And had that first miracle not occurred, nothing would have followed. Well, that first miracle, I would suggest, was that those 55 men committed to stay in the room. They committed to stay at the table. They committed, notwithstanding their personal differences, and again, some very, very strong, opinionated, and principled men had very different ideas. But bringing forward this new nation was a higher principle. So they stayed in the room, they stayed at the table, and they hammered out what they called the Grand Compromise. Today we call it the Constitution. We call their meeting the Constitutional Convention, and their meeting hall is now Independence Hall. And if we learned anything from that, it's to stay in the room, stay at the table, and find American solutions to American problems, and recognize that not everyone gets everything they want every time they sit down, but you have to be willing never to compromise your principles, but to engage in the art of a principled compromise to be able to govern this great state and our nation. That's the miracle that occurred in Philadelphia, and that's the example that we should all take to heart and try to emulate today.